Today I will talk about what I call the model of plenitude. It's an argument for a new kind of living, a new style of life, which has both a labor market dimension to it, so time use, a consumption dimension to it, and a production dimension to it. And I think one of the big messages that I want to leave us with today is the importance of a really holistic vision for going forward. We can't solve our ecological crisis merely through some technological tinkering or from just making a change in one part of society, but I want to talk about how all these various parts fit together. So let me just begin with a point that everyone knows, and that is we are in an ecological crisis. And this is a diagram from a paper which came out in Nature in 2009, September. It's known as the Planetary Boundaries paper. It was put together by a worldwide team of scientists and ecologists who attempted to measure what they call the safe operating space for humans on the planet, or the planetary boundaries within which human impacts must reside. And they looked they identified 9 different boundaries that we have to respect. We're able to quantify 7 of them. Argued that on 3, we are well beyond the safe boundary. These will be familiar problems to you. The first is climate, of course. That's the one on the top there. On the right, the nitrogen cycle and biodiversity. All of those are, I think, reasonably well known. Also looked at ozone depletion. We're approaching the boundary. Ocean acidification, something that's getting more and more attention these days. We are approaching the boundary. Ocean ecosystems are in collapse and in grave danger. Global freshwater use and land system change. So we have a climate problem, but we have an array of related ecological problems as well. Climate exacerbating many of these, biodiversity, ocean acidification, and so forth are affected very much by the climate system. The second point I want to start with, just to set context, is that to think about how to move forward into a more sustainable and ecologically viable way of living, we have to take account of the fact that we entered a global economic crisis at the end of 2007, and that in many parts of the world, particularly the wealthier parts of the world, that crisis is a very important part of what's happening in social life, in political life, and in economic life. And any vision for sustainability, for a truly ecological, different lifestyle, needs to take account of the factors and the context which has now shaped us for quite a few years. We are already into year 4 of this crisis. Important point to remember about it is that it is in some ways a manufactured crisis. That is, if we think about the problems of the Eurozone, or if we think about the problem in the United States right now, we are living through something very similar to what happened in the 1920s and 30s. So a global collapse of demand, and the inability to restructure and move out of that and to solve that crisis was in large part due to the stranglehold of financial interests who argued for austerity, who argued for high-valued currencies and so forth, and kept Europe in the 20s and the United States in the 30s in a period of stagnation for a long period of time. And we see that mistake being repeated today, which is that the interests of the financiers, maintaining, reducing deficits and anti-inflationary policy and so forth is paramount in the conduct of economic policy right now. And I'm happy to come back to this in the question and answer. It's much more complicated than it was in the 20s and 30s when, if we could just reflate, grow our way out of stagnation, because of course we have an ecological constraint on growth now, which we didn't at that time. But we have now this political constraint from the power of finance, as well as the ecological constraints. So that's complicated. This is the Western European unemployment rate from 1970 to 2005. And one of the things you see is that growing structural unemployment and also underemployment throughout Europe. And these are the most recent figures. In the Eurozone, you have official unemployment of about 10%, which means that true unemployment is higher because of hidden unemployment, underemployment, and so forth. And of course, in some countries like Spain, the unemployment rate is even twice that. So very high levels of unemployment and underemployment throughout Europe. And something similar going on in the US, which prior to this point had much better official job creation. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about the wonders of American job creation and so forth. Of course, most of those jobs have been low-wage, low-paid, insecure jobs. But even that characteristic of the US economy is gone. US employment has collapsed. So this is employment, not unemployment. But we went from having something like 62.5% of our employable labor force age population in work, and that's the high point that you see there, to after the collapse now, we're at about 58% and have very much leveled off. And that is a dramatic, dramatic change in employment. In the US, there are something like 25 million people who are either out of work altogether, officially unemployed, or underemployed. So part-time work, but want full-time work. And this doesn't include discouraged workers and so forth. There are 4 workers for every, looking for every available position. So it's very widespread unemployment and underemployment in the US. A labor market that in both Europe and the US is badly out of equilibrium, badly away from the goal of giving work to all who need and want it. Now, I said something about the ecological constraint on growth, which is that there are a number of dimensions to this. The one that I think people are most familiar with, of course, is emissions. When we grow faster, we emit much more in the way of greenhouse gases. And the progress that we've made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions through vehicle changes for higher mileage, or in buildings to get more energy efficiency and so forth, are continually being wiped out, as we say, or taken away through the increasing scale of production. So one of the things that we see from the social, scientific, and the economic literature on climate change is that the countries that have really managed to reduce emissions do so in the context of major drops in GNP or GDP. And that countries which continue to grow have been more or less unable to get sustained reductions in emissions. And of course, as you are all familiar, I'm sure the wealthy countries have targets of 90% emission reductions if we are to get to, by 2050, according to not all scientists, but by the, what I like to think of the cutting edge of science, which is arguing that we need to get to that 350 parts per million. So that's more than the IPCC, but they're badly out of date at this point. So we have dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we have to achieve. Continuing to increase the scale of production makes it very difficult. I'll just mention one thing from the United States, which is that in the sectors, since 1970, the sectors where we had the most improvement in efficiency, in energy efficiency, residential household energy use, transportation, particularly aviation, we had the biggest increases in actual energy use. And that's what economists would have predicted, because what increases in efficiency do is they make the price of energy cheaper for people, the effective price of energy. So if there's no attempt to control demand, if there's nothing to prevent that scale from going up, that's precisely what happens. And particularly if you look historically at the whole era, the fossil fuel era, one of the things that we see is that cheap energy powers growth. It's almost like what we would call a turbocharged engine of growth, that periods of cheap energy are associated with very rapid growth. So the technological fix, I think, is not going to work. We really need to control that scale of production. Now, this is a picture of global food prices, and one of the things, this is from, I'm sorry, you can't see the bottom axis, from 2005 to 2011. Now, you see the run-up in food prices to the financial collapse. So between 2005 and 2008, you have a huge increase, pretty much a doubling of global food prices, which is really quite stupendous. One of the things you may remember from the period right before the crisis was food riots going on around the world because food prices were rising so much. You can remember it again from the Arab Spring, one of the factors that caused uprising in Western Asia. But the really interesting thing about this is how short-lived the dampening effect of the global recession was on food prices. Of course, when you have a global contraction, commodities prices will fall. Oil prices fell, other commodities fell, and food commodities fell. But now those food prices have risen so rapidly since 2010, and they have gone from the low point there that you see to a point above where they were in 2008. Growth on a global scale is now associated with big increases in commodity prices. This is a dramatic shift from what had been happening for the previous 100 years. For those of you who have studied development economics or followed the debates about the global South and the global North up through into the 80s, and actually even into the 90s, one of the things you may remember was the countries of the global South complaining about the fact that the commodities that they exported had such low prices. And we had a century of declining, long-term decline in food prices, in commodities prices more generally. And beginning in 2000, that has changed. And we are now on an upward trajectory. And one of the possible interpretations of that, and it's one that's getting more and more credence in the scholarly literature, is that it has to do with bumping up against those natural resource limits, so that the demands on the world's ecosystems are a key part of why commodities prices are rising. Of course, they're not the only part. There's speculation going on as well, but in part that has to do with traders' expectations about what's going forward. There's peak oil, there's growing demand relative to supply of food around the world, and of course the use of land to produce fuel, which is only going to become more and more intense. That conflict between food and fuel is another thing that's driving this, and there was just a major report arguing that the recent prices are due to this. So for those of us in the global North who are thinking about ethical, responsible, particularly globally ethical solutions for moving forward, thinking about the globe in terms of these increasing pressures on land use, on fuel use, and so forth is really important. And it means that we have to think about how we can reduce the pressures that we are putting on the planet.